am the Epileptic Explorer, and tonight we will hopefully finish our reading in Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo. This was a series on Netflix, and it only went through the first two books of the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and possibly, I think, both books of the Six of Crows duology. So, without further ado, let's try to finish tonight. We'll try to do a super read, and we'll see where it takes us. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and continue reading Ruin and Rising. Chapter 16. It wouldn't be safe to approach Grabursk on this side of the fold. So we decided to stage our attack from West Ravka, and that meant dealing with the logistics of a crossing. Because Nadia and Zoya couldn't keep the return aloft with too many additional passengers, we agreed that Tulia would escort the Soldat Soul to the eastern shore of the fold and wait for us there. It would take them a full day on horseback, and that would give the rest of us time to enter West Ravka and locate a suitable base camp. Then we'd loop back to lead the others across the fold under the protection of my power. We boarded the return, and mere hours later, we were speeding toward the strange black fog of the Shadowfold. This time, when we entered the darkness, I was prepared. For the sense of familiarity that gripped me, that feeling of likeness, it was even stronger now that I dabbled in Mir Most, the very power that had created this place. I understood it better too. The need that had driven the Darkling to try to recreate Morozova's experiments. A legacy he felt was his. The Volca came at us, and I glimpsed the dim shapes of their wings, heard their cries as they tore at the circle of light I summoned. If the Darkling had his way, they'd soon be well fed. I was grateful when we burst into the sky above West Ravka. The territory west of the fold had been evacuated. We flew over abandoned villages and houses, all without seeing a soul. In the end, we needed to set up in an apple farm just southwest of what was left of Novokribersk. Less than a mile from the dark reach of the fold. It was called Tumikiana, the name written across the side of the canary, and the barn full of cider presses. Its orchards were thick with fruit that would never be harvested. The owner's house was lavish, a perfect little cake of a building, lovingly maintained and topped with a white cupola. I felt almost guilty as Harshaw broke a window and climbed inside to unlock the doors. New money, sniffed Zoya as we made our way through the over-decorated rooms, each shelf and mantel brimming with porcelain figurines and curios. Genya picked up a ceramic pig. Vile. I like it here, protested Adric. It's nice. Zoya made a retching sound. Maybe taste will come with age. I'm only 3 years younger than you. Sorry if my Scottish is coming out. The furniture had been covered with sheets. Misha yanked one free and ran from room to room, trailing it behind him like a cape. Most of the cupboards had been emptied, but Harsha found a tin of sardines that he opened and shared with Oncat. We'd have to send people out to neighboring farms to scout for food. Once we'd made sure there were no other squatters, we left David, Genya, and Misha to get started procuring materials for the production of lumia and blasting powders. Then the rest of us reboarded the Pattern to cross back to Ravka. We planned to reunite with the Soldat Soul at the monument of Sancta Anastasia that stood on a low hill overlooking what had once been Semna. Thanks to Anastasia, Semna had survived the wasting plague that had claimed half the population of the surrounding villages. But Semna hadn't survived the fold. Where was I? Oh. It had been swallowed up when the Black Heretics' disastrous experiments first created the Unsea. The monument was an eerie sight. A giant stone woman rising out of the earth, arms spread wide, her benevolent gaze fixed on the nothingness of the fold. Anastasia was rumored to have rid countless towns of sickness. Had she worked miracles, or was she simply a talented healer? Was there any difference? We'd arrived before the Soldat Sol, so we landed and made camp for the night. The air was still warm enough that we didn't need tents, and we laid our bedrolls next to the foot of the statue near a patchy field studded with red boulders. Sorry for the commercial. Mal took Harsha with him to try to find game for dinner. It was scarce down here, as if animals were just as wary of the unsea as we were. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and walked down the hill to the edge of the black shore. 2 days, I thought as I looked into the seething black mists. I knew better than to think I understood what lay ahead of me. Every time I tried to predict my fate, my life had been upended. I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. I turned and froze. Nikolai was perched atop a high rock. He was cleaner. Where did I put others? Where was I? He was cleaner than he had been. But he wore the same ragged trousers, his taloned feet gripped the ridge of the rock, and his shadow wings beat gently at the air, his gaze black and unreadable. I'd been hoping he would show himself again, but now I wasn't sure what to do. Had he been watching us? What had he seen? How much had he understood? Carefully, I reached into my pocket, afraid my sudden movement might make him bolt. I held out my hand, the Landsov emerald resting on my palm. He frowned, a line appearing between his brows, then folded his wings and leapt soundlessly from the rock. It was hard not to back away. I didn't want to be afraid, but the way he moved was so inhuman. He stalked toward me slowly, eyes focused on the ring. When he was less than a foot away, he cocked his head to one side. Despite the black eyes and the inky lines that coursed up his neck, he still had an elegant face. His mother's fine cheekbones, the strong jaw that must have come from his ambassador father. His frown deepened. Then he reached out and plucked the emerald up in his claws. The words died on my lips. Nikolai turned my palm over and slid the ring onto my finger. My breath caught between a laugh and a sob. He knew me. I couldn't stop the tears that welled in my eyes. He pointed to my hand and made a sweeping gesture. It took me a second to grasp his meaning. He was imitating the way I moved when I summoned. You want me to call the lights? His face stayed blank. I let sunlight pool in my palm. This? The glow seemed to galvanize him. He seized my hand and slapped it against his chest. I tried to draw away, but he held my hand in place. His grip was vice-like, made stronger by whatever monstrous thing the Darkling had placed inside him. I shook my head. No! Again, he slapped my hand against his chest, the movement almost frantic. I don't know what my power will do to you, I protested. The corner of his mouth curled, the faintest suggestion of Nikolai's weary smile. I could almost hear him say, "Really, lovely? What could be worse?" Beneath my hand, his heart beat. steady and human. I released a long breath. "All right," I said. "I'll try." I summoned the barest bit of light, letting it flow through my palm. He winced, but held my hand firmly in place. I pushed a little harder, trying to direct the light into him, thinking of the spaces between, keeping it through his skin. The black cracks on his torso began to recede. I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. Could it possibly be this simple? "It's working," I gasped. He grimaced, but waved me on, asking for more. I called the light into him, watching the black veins fade and recoil. He was panting now, his eyes closed. A low, pained whine rose from his throat. His grip around my wrist was iron. "Nikolai!" Then I felt something push back, as if the darkness within him was fighting. It shoved against the light. All at once, the cracks exploded outward, just as dark as before, but like the roots of a tree drinking deep of poisoned water. Nikolai flinched and shoved away from me with a frustrated snarl. He looked down at my chest, misery carved into his features. It was no good. Only the cut worked on the Nishovia. It might well destroy the thing inside Nikolai, but it would kill him too. His shoulders slumped. His wings roiled with the same shifting movement as the fold. "We'll think of something. David will come up with a solution, or we'll find a healer." He dropped his haunches, elbows resting on his knees, face buried in his hands. Nikolai had been infinitely capable, confident in his belief that every problem had a solution, and he would be the one to find it. I couldn't bear seeing him this way, broken and defeated for the first time. I approached him cautiously and crouched down. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Tentatively, I reached out and touched his arm, ready to draw back if he startled or snapped. His skin was warm, the feel of it unchanged despite the shadows lurking beneath it. I slipped my arms around him, careful of the wings that rustled at his back. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He dropped his forehead to my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Nikolai." He released a small, shuddering sigh. Then he inhaled and tensed. He turned his head. I felt his breath on my neck, the scrape of one of his teeth beneath my jaw. "Nikolai?" His arms clamped around me. His claws dug into my back. There was no mistaking the growl that issued from his chest. I pushed away from him and shot to my feet. "Stop!" I said harshly. His hands flexed. His lips had pulled back to reveal his onyx fangs. I knew what I saw in him. Appetite. "Don't!" I pleaded. "This isn't you! You can't control this!" He took a step toward me. Another rumbling. Animal growl rolled through him. I lifted my hands. "Nikolai," I said warningly, "I will put you down." I saw the moment that reason returned. His face crumpled in horror at what he'd wanted to do, at what some part of him probably still wanted to do. His body was trembling with the desire to feed. His black eyes brimmed with flickering shadows. Were they tears? He clenched his fists, threw back his head. The tendons in his neck knotted, and he released an echoing shriek of helplessness and rage. I'd heard it before, when the Darkling summoned the Nishovia, the rending of the fabric of the world, the cry of something that should not be. He launched himself into the air and hurled straight for the fold. "Nikolai!" I screamed, but he was already gone, swallowed by the seething blackness, lost to the Volcra's domain. I heard footsteps turned to see Maul, Harsha, and Zoya running toward me. Oncat yowling and darting between their legs. Harsha had his flint out, and Maul was unslinging his rifle. Zoya's eyes were wide. "Was that a Nishovia?" I shook my head. It was Nikolai. They stopped dead. "We found us?" He found us? Said Maul. He's been tracking us since we left the spinning wheel. But the Darkling, if he were the Darkling's creature, we'd already be dead. How long have you known he was following us? Asked Zoya angrily. I saw him once back at the copper mine. There was nothing to do about it. We could have had Maul put an arrow through him, said Harshaw. I jabbed a finger at him. I wouldn't abandon you, and I'm not abandoning Nikolai. Easy, said Maul, stepping forward. He's gone now, and there's no point fighting about it. Harshaw, go start a fire. Zoya, the grouse we caught need cleaning. She stared at him and didn't budge. He rolled his eyes. All right, they need cleaning by someone else. Please go find somebody to order around. My pleasure. Harshaw returned his flint to his sleeve. They're all crazy on Cat, he said to the tabby. Invisible armies, monster princes. Let's go set fire to something. I rubbed a hand over my eyes as they walked off. Are you going to yell at me too? No, I've wanted to shoot Nikolai plenty of times, but that seems a little petty now. Curious about that ring, though. I'd forgot about the massive jewel on my hand. I pulled it off and shoved it in my pocket. Nikolai gave it to me back at the spinning wheel. I thought I might recognize it. Did he? I think so. Before he tried to eat me. Saints. He flew into the fold. Do you think he meant to kill himself? I don't know. Maybe it's like a vacation home to him now. I don't even know if the Volca would see him as prey. I leaned against the boulder Nikolai had been perched on just minutes before. He tried to have me heal him. It didn't work. You don't know what you may be able to do once the amplifiers are brought together. You mean after I murder you? Alina, we are not talking about this. You can't just pull the covers over your head and pretend this isn't happening. Can and will. You're being a brat. And you're being noble and self-sacrificing, and it makes me want to throttle you. Well, that's a start. That's not funny. How am I supposed to deal with this? He asked. I don't feel noble or self-sacrificing. I'm just what? He threw up his hands. Hungry. You're hungry? Yes, he snapped. I'm hungry, and I'm tired, and I'm pretty sure that Toya's going to eat all the grouse. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. Zoya warned me about this. She gets cranky when she's hungry too. I'm not cranky. Sulky, I amended graciously. I am not sulking. You're right, I said, trying to restrain my giggles. Definitely more of a pout than a sulk. He snagged my hand and pulled me in for a kiss. He nipped my ear once. Hard. Ow! I told you I was hungry. You're the second person to try to bite me today. Oh, it gets worse. When we get back to camp, I'm requesting the third tail of Craigie. I'm telling Harshaw you're a dog person. I'm telling Zoya you don't like her hair. We kept it up all the way back to the return, shoving and taunting each other, feeling a little bit of the strain of the last week's seas. But as the sun set and I looked over my shoulder into the fold, I wondered what human things might remain beyond its shores, and they could hear our laughter. The Soldat Soul arrived late that night and got only a few hours of sleep before we set out the next day. They were wary as we entered the fold, but I expected them to be far worse, clutching icons and chanting prayers. When we took our first steps into the darkness, and I let the light burst forth in a flood around us, I understood. They didn't need to plead with their saints. They had me. The Pattern drifted high above us, well within the roof of the bright bubble I had created. but I'd chosen to travel on the sand so that I could practice bending light within the confines of the fold. To the soul that soul, this display of power was one more miracle, further proof that I was a living saint. I remembered the apparat's claim: "There is no greater power than faith, and there will be no greater army than one driven by it." I prayed that he was right, that I wasn't just another leader taking their loyalty and repaying them with useless, honorable deaths. It took us the better part of that day and night to cross the fold and escort all of the Soldat soul up the western shore. By the time we arrived back to Tomikiana, David and Genya had completely taken over. The kitchen looked like a storm had blown through. Bubbling pots covered the cook stove, and a huge kettle had been brought in from the cider press to serve as a cooling tub. David perched on a stool at the big wooden table where the servants had probably rolled dough only weeks before. Now it was littered with glass and metal, smears of some tar-like substance, and countless little bottles of foul-smelling yellow sludge. "This is entirely safe," I asked him. "Is this entirely safe?" I asked him. "Nothing is entirely safe." "How reassuring," he smiled. "I'm glad." In the dining room, Genya had set up her own workspace, where she was hoping to construct canisters for the Lumia and slings that would carry them. The others could activate them as late as they dared during the attack. And if something happened to me on the fold, they might still have enough light to get out. All of the farm owners' glassware had been conscripted: goblets, nifters, wine and liquor glasses, an elaborate collective of vases, and a chafing dish in the shape of a fish. The tea set had been filled with screws and grommets, and Misha sat cross-legged on a silk-cushioned chair, gleefully deconstructing saddles and organizing the strips and bits of leather into careful piles. Harsha was dispatched to steal whatever food he could find from nearby estates, work he seemed disturbingly adept at. I labored beside Genya and Misha for most of the day. Out in the gardens, the squallers practiced creating an acoustic blanket. It was a variation on the trick Zoya had performed after the cave-in, and we hoped it would allow us to enter the fold and take up our positions in darkness without attracting the attention of the Volcra. It would be a temporary measure at best, but we just needed to last long enough to enable the ambush. Periodically, my ears would crackle and all sound would seem to dampen. Then I'd hear Nadia as clearly as she were standing in the room with me, or Adric's voice booming in my ear. The pop of gunfire floated back to us from the orchard where Maul and the twins were choosing the best marksmen from the Soldat Soul. We had to be cautious with our ammunition, so they used their bullets sparingly. Later, I heard them in the parlor, sorting through weapons and supplies. We pieced together a dinner of apples, hard cheese, and stale black beet bread that Harshaw had found in some abandoned larder. The dining room and kitchen were a wreck, so we built a big fire in the grate of the grand receiving room and set out a makeshift picnic, sprawled on the floor and watered silk couches, toasting bits of bread skewered on the gnarled branches of apple trees. "If I survive this," I said, wiggling my toes near the fire, "I'm going to have to find some way to compensate these poor people for the damages." Zoya snorted. "They'll be forced to redecorate. We're doing them a favor." "And if we don't survive," observed David, "this whole place will be enveloped in darkness." Toya pushed aside a flowered cushion. "Might be for the best." Harsha took a swig of cider from the jug Tamar had brought in from the press. If I live, the first thing I'm doing is coming back here and swimming around in a tank of this stuff. Go easy, Harsha, said Tamar. We need you awake tomorrow. He groaned. Why do battles always have to be so early? Grudgingly, he gave up the jug to one of the soldat soul. Let's just check. See. Okay. Okay. Just making sure. We'd gone over the plan until all of us were sure we knew exactly where to be and when. We'd enter the fold at dawn. The scholars would go in first to lay down the acoustic blanket and hide our movements from the Volcra. I'd heard Nadia whispering with Tamar about not wanting Adric with them, but Tamar had argued hard in favor of including him. He's a warrior, she'd said. If you make him believe he's less now, he'll never know he can be more. I would be with the squallers, in case anything went wrong. The marksman and the other Grisha would follow. We planned the ambush at the center of the fold, almost directly between Gribursk and Novokribursk. Once we spotted the Darkling skiff, I would eliminate the Unsi, bending the light to keep us invisible. If that didn't bring him to a halt, our marksmen would. They would thin his ranks, and then it was up to Harsha and the squallers to create enough chaos that the twins and I could board the skiff, locate the students, and get them to safety. Once they were clear, I would deal with the Darkling. Hopefully he would never see me coming. Genya and David would remain at Tomikiana with Misha. I knew Misha would insist on going with us, so Genya had slipped a sleeping draft into his dinner. He was already yawning, curled up near the grate, and I hoped he would sleep through our departure in the morning. The night wore on. We knew we needed to sleep, but no one much felt like it. Some people decided to bed down by the fire in the receiving room, while others trickled out in the house in pairs. Nobody wanted to be alone tonight. Genya and David had to work in the kitchens. Tamar and Nadia had disappeared early. I thought Zoya might take her pick of the soldat, but as I slipped out of the door, she was still watching the fire, Oncat purring on her lap. I made my way down the dark hall to the parlor, where Maul was making a final check of the weapons and gear. It was a strange sight to see the piles of guns and ammunition stacked on a marble tabletop next to the framed miniatures of the lady of the house and a pretty collection of snuff boxes. We've been here before, he said. We have? When we came out of the fold the first time, we stopped in the orchard, not very far from the house. I recognized it earlier when we were out shooting. Give me a moment. Sorry, just had to make sure our cat didn't sneak into our room. Making sure I myself had closed the door. But anywho, where was I? Oh yeah. Oh. Okay, I remembered. It seemed like a lifetime ago. The fruit on the trees had been too small and sour to eat. How did the soldat do? How did the soldat soul do today? Not bad. Only a few of them have much range, but if we're lucky, that's all we'll need. A lot of them saw action in the first army, so at least there's a chance they'll keep their heads. Laughter drifted back to us from this receiving room. Someone, Harsha I suspected, had started singing, but in the parlor it was quiet, and I could hear that it had begun to rain. Maul, I said, do you think it's the amplifiers? He frowned, checking the sight on the rifle. What do you mean? Is that what's between us? My power and yours? Is that why we became friends? Why? I trailed off. He picked up another gun, sighted down the barrel. Maybe that brought us together, but it didn't make us who we are. It didn't make you the girl you could get me to laugh when I had nothing. Uh, it sure didn't make me the idiot who took that for granted. Whatever there was between us, we forged it. It belongs to us. Then we set down the rifle and wiped his hands on a rag. Come with me, he said, taking my hand and pulling me behind him. We moved through the darkened house. I heard voices singing something bawdy down the hall. Footsteps overhead as someone ran from one room to the next. I thought Maul might lead up the stairs to the bedrooms. I guess I hoped he would, but instead he took me through the east wing of the house, past a silent sewing room, a library, all the way to the windowless vestibule lined with trowels, spades, and dried cuttings. Delightful. Wait here. He opened a door I hadn't seen, tucked into the wall. In the dim light, I saw it led to some kind of long, narrow conservatory. The rain beat a steady rhythm against the vaulted roof and glazed glass walls. Maul moved deeper into the room, lighting lanterns that rested on the edge of a slender reflecting pool. Apple trees lined the walls, their boughs dense with clusters of white flowers. Their petals lay like a smattering of snow on the red tile floor and floated on the surface of the water. I trailed Maul down the length of the pool. The air inside was balmy, sweet with apple blossoms and loamy with the rich scent of soil. Outside, the wind rose and howled with the storm, but in here it was as if the seasons had been suspended. It had the strangest sense that we could be anywhere, but that the rest of the house had simply fallen away, and we were completely alone. As far as the far end of the room, a desk was tucked into the corner. A shawl had been thrown over the back of the scroll work chair. There was a basket of sewing things resting on a rug patterned with apple blossoms. The lady of the house must have come here to do her needlework, to sip her morning tea. In the daytime, she would have had a perfect view of the orchards through the big arched windows. A book was open on the desk, appeared at the pages. It's a diary, Maul said. Statistics on the spring crop, the progress of hybrid trees. Her glasses, I said, picking up the gold wire frames. I wonder if she's missing them. Maul leaned against the stone rim of the pool. Do you ever wonder what it might have been like if the Grisha examiners had discovered your power back in Karamzin? Sometimes. Ravka would be different. Maybe not. My power was useless before we found the stag. Without you, we might never have located any of the Barozimus amplifiers. You'd be different, he said. I put the delicate frames aside and flipped through the columns of numbers in tidy handwriting. What kind of person might I have been? Would I have become friends with Genya or simply seen her as a servant? Would I have had Zoya's confidence? Her easy arrogance? What would the Darkling have have been to me? I can tell you what he would have I can tell you what would have happened, I said. Go on. I closed the diary and turned back to Maul, perching on the edge of the desk. I would have gone to the little palace and been spoiled and pampered. I would have dined off of golden plates and never would have struggled to use my power. It would have been like breathing, the way it always should have been, and in time, it would have forgotten Karamzin. I would have forgotten Karamzin. And me. Never you. He raised a brow. Possibly, I admitted. He laughed. The Darkling would have sought Morozov's amplifiers, fruitlessly, hopelessly, until one day a tracker, a new one, at Odkazia orphan, an Otkazia's orphan, traveled into the ice of Sibia. You're assuming I didn't die on the fold. In my version, you were never sent into the fold. When you tell the story, you can die tragically. In that case, carry on. This nobody, this nothing, this pathetic orphan, I get it. He would be the first to spot the stag after centuries of searching. So of course the Darkling and I would have to travel to Sibia in his great black coach. In the snow? His great black sleigh, I amended. And when we arrived at Trinast, your unit would be led into our exalted presence. Are we allowed to walk, or do we wriggle in our bellies like the lowly worms we are? You walk, but you do it with a lot of deference. I would be seated on a raised dais, and I would wear jewels in my hair and a golden kefta. Not black? I paused. Maybe black. It wouldn't matter, Maul said. I still wouldn't be able to stop looking at you. I laughed. No, you would be making eyes at Zoya. Zoya's there? Isn't she always? He smiled. I would have noticed you. Of course you would. I'm the Sun Summoner, after all. You know what I mean. I looked down, brushing petals off the desk. Did you ever notice me at Karamzin? He was silent for a long moment, and when I glanced at him, he was looking up the glass ceiling. He'd gone red as a beet. Maul? He cleared his throat, crossed his arms. As a matter of fact, I did. I had some very distracting thoughts about you. You did? I sputtered. And I felt guilty for every one of them. You were supposed to be my best friend, not... He shrugged. And turned even redder. Idiot. That fact is well established and adds nothing to the plot. Well, I said, taking another swipe at the petals. It wouldn't matter if you noticed me, because I would have noticed you. A lowly Otkozia. Otkozia? That's right, I said quietly. I didn't feel like teasing him anymore. And what would you have seen? A soldier? Cocky, scarred, extraordinary, and that would have been our beginning. He rose and closed the distance between us. And this still would have been our end. He was right, even in dreams. We had no future. If we somehow both survived tomorrow, I would have to seek an alliance and a crown. Maul would have to find a way to keep his heritage a secret. Gently, he took my face in his hands. I would have been different too, without you. Weaker, reckless. He smiled slightly. Afraid of the dark. He brushed the tears from my cheeks. I wasn't sure when they'd started, but no matter who or what I was, I would have been yours. I kissed him, with grief and and years of longing, with desperate hope that I could keep him here in my arms. With the knowledge that I could not, I leaned into him, the press of his chest, the breadth of his shoulders. Going to miss this, he said as he kissed my cheeks, my jaw, my eyelids. The way you taste, he set his lips to the hollow beneath my ear. The way you smell, his hand slid up my back. The way you feel, my breath hitched as his hips settled against mine. Then he drew back, searching my eyes. I wanted more for you, he said. A white veil in your hair. Vows we could keep. A proper wedding night? Just tell me this isn't goodbye. That's the only vow I need. I love you, Alina. He kissed me again. He hadn't answered, but I didn't care, because his mouth was on mine. And in this moment, I could pretend I wasn't a savior or a saint. That I could simply choose him, have a life, be in love. That we wouldn't have one night. We would have thousands. I pulled him down with me, easing his body over mine, feeling the cold floor at my back. He had soldier's hands, rough and calloused, heating my skin, sending hungry sparks through my body that made me lift my hips to try and bring him closer. I pulled his shirt over his head, letting my fingers trail over the smooth ridges of his muscled back, feeling the lightly raised lines of the words that marked him. But when he slid the fabric of my blouse from my arms, I stiffened, feeling suddenly painfully aware of every wrong thing about me. Jutting bones, 2 small breasts, skin pale and dry as an onion. Then he cupped my cheek, his thumb tracing my lip. You are all I've ever wanted, he said. You're the whole of my heart. I saw myself then, sour, silly, difficult, lovely in his eyes. I drew him to me, felt him shudder as our bodies came together, skin against skin, felt the heat of his lips, his tongue, hands moving until the need between us drew taut and anxious as a bestowing waiting for release. He clasped my hand to my waist, and my mind filled with light. All I saw was Maul's face, and all I felt was his body, above me, around me, an awkward rhythm at first, then slow and steady as the beat of the rain. It was all we needed. It was all we would ever have. That is the end of chapter 16. Let me take care of this one quick moment, and I'll be right back with reading. We are now 13 chapters from finishing the book. Alright. Okay. Alright. We're doing good so far. So we just finished chapter 16. We are now on chapter 17. Okay. Chapter 17. The next morning, I woke to find that Maul had already risen. He left me a pot of hot tea on a tray surrounded by apple blossoms. The rain had stopped, but the walls of the conservatory were covered in mist. I rubbed my sleeve against a pane of glass, and looked out into the deep blue of early dawn. A deer was moving between the trees, head bent to the sweet grass. I dressed slowly, drank my tea, lingered by the reflecting pool where the lanterns had long since gone out. In a few hours' time, this place might be buried in darkness. I went to remember every detail on a whim. I picked up a pen and flipped to the last page of the diary and wrote our names. Alina Starkov, Maylene Ortsev. I wasn't sure why I did it. I just needed to say we had been there. I found the others packing up in the main hall. Genya waylaid me by the door with my coat in her hands. The olive wool was freshly pressed. You should look your best when you put the darklings in the ground. Thanks, I said with a smile. I'll try not to bleed all over it. She kissed both my cheeks. Good luck. We'll be waiting when you get back. I took her hand and placed Nikolai's ring in her palm. If something goes wrong, if we don't make it, take David and Misha and get to Ozkurvo. This should buy you all the help you need. She swallowed, then hugged me hard. Outside, the Soldat Sol waited in rigid formation, rifles on their backs, canisters of inactive Lumia slung over their shoulders. The tattoos on their faces looked fierce in the dawn light. The Grisha were rough spun. They might have been ordinary soldiers. Harshaw had left Anket curled up with Misha, but now she sat in the parlor window, lazily grooming herself and watching us assemble. Tolya and Timur had their golden sunbursts pinned to their chests. Malls was still with Misha. He smiled when he saw me and tapped the space where the pin would have gone, right over his heart. The deer had scattered. The orchard was empty as we moved through it, boots leaving deep marks on the soft earth. A half hour later, the orchard was empty as we moved through it, the boots leaving deep marks on the soft earth. A half hour later, we were standing at the shores of the fold. I joined the other Erthralki, Zoya, Nadia, Adric, and Harshaw. It felt somehow right that we should be the first to enter and that we should do it together. The squallers raised their arms, summoning current and dropping the pressure as Zoya had done back in the caves. My ears crackled as they layered the acoustic blanket. If it didn't hold, Harsha and I were ready to summon light and fire to drive the Volkra back. We spread out in a line, and with measured steps, we entered the darkness of the fold. The unseen always felt like the end of everything. It wasn't only the dark, it was the terrible sense of isolation, as if the world had disappeared, leaving only you. The rattle of your breath, the stuttering beat of your heart. As we stepped onto the dead gray sands and the darkness thickened around us, it took everything in me not to raise my hands and wrap all of It took everything in me not to raise my hands and wrap all of us in safe, protective light. I listened closely, expecting to hear the beating of wings, one of those horrible, inhuman shrieks, but I heard nothing, not even our footsteps on the sand. Whatever the squallers were doing was working. The silence was deep and impenetrable. "Hello?" I whispered. "We hear you," I whirled. I knew Zoya was farther down. down the line, but it sounded like she was speaking right in my ear. We moved at a steady pace. I heard a click, then almost 10 minutes later, a double click. We'd gone a mile. At one point, I heard the distant flap of wings above us, and I felt fear move through our ranks like a living thing. The Volca might not hear us, but they could scent prey from miles away. Were they circling above us even now, sensing that something was wrong, that someone was near? I doubted Zoya's trick would keep us safe for long. The absolute madness of what we were doing struck me in that moment. We had dared what no one else ever had. We'd entered the fold without light. We kept moving. 2 clicks later, we stopped and took our positions to wait. As soon as we sighted the darkling skiff, we'd have to move quickly. My thoughts turned to him. Cautiously, I tested the tether that bound us. Hunger quaked through me with palpable force. He was eager, ready to unleash the power of the fold, ready for a fight. I felt it too. I let it echo back to him, that rush of anticipation, that need. I am coming for you. Maul and Toya maybe all of the others believed that the amplifiers had to be brought together, but they had never felt the thrill of using Merzost. It was something no other Grisha understood, and in the end, it was what bound the Darkling and me most closely. Not our powers, not the strangeness of them, not that we were both aberrations, if not abominations. It was our knowledge of the forbidden, our desire for more. The minutes ticked by, and my nerves began to jangle. The squallers could maintain the acoustic blanket for only so long. What if the Darkling waited until night to attack? Where are you? The answer came in a pale violet glow, moving toward us from the east. 2 clicks. We fanned out in the formation we had practiced. 3 clicks. That was my signal. I raised my hands and set the fold ablaze. In the same moment, I bent the light, letting it flow around each of our soldiers like a stream. What did the Darkling see? Dead sands. The flat sheen of a gray sky.
Right now at Les Schwab, save $60 on
The ruined hulks of skiffs falling to dust. And that was all. We were invisible. We were air. The skiff slowed as it drew closer. I saw its black sails marked with the sun in eclipse. The strange smoked glass quality of its hull. The violet flame of the lumia shimmered over its sides, vague and flickering in the bright glare of my power. Squallers stood at the masts of their blue kefta. A few inferni lined the railings, flanked by heartrenders in red, heavily armed Operniki in gray. It was a spare force. The students must be below decks. The Darkling stood at the prow, surrounded by his shadow horde. As always, the first sight of him was practically a physical blow. It was like going to him in a vision. He was simply more real, more vibrant than everything else around him. It happened so fast. I barely had time to register it. The first shot struck one of the Darklings, Operniki. He toppled over the skiff's railing. Then the shots came in a rapid pattern, like raindrops on a rooftop at the start of a storm. Grisha and Operniki slumped and fell against one another as confusion broke out aboard the glass skiff. I saw more bodies fall. Someone shouted, "Return fire!" and the air erupted with the jarring thunder of gunshots, but we were safely out of range. The Nishovia beat their wings, returning in wide arcs, searching for targets. Flints were struck, and the Inferni who remained on the skiff sent gouts of flame flaring through the air. Cloaked from sight, Harshaw turned the fire back on them. I heard screams, then silence, broken only by moaning and shouted orders from the glass skiff. Our sharpshooters had done their job well. The area around the railing was littered with bodies. The Darkling, unharmed, was pointing to a heart render and issuing some kind of command. I couldn't make out his words, but I knew this was when he would use the students. I looked around me, tracking shooters, the Grisha, feeling their presence in the light. A single click. The squalor sent a wave of sand crashing through the air. More shouts rose from the deck as the Darkling squalors tried to respond. That was our cue. The twins and I bolted off the skiff, approaching from the stern. We didn't have much time. Where are they? Toya whispered as we boarded. It was strange to hear his voice, but not to see him. Maybe below, I replied. The skiff was shallow, but there was room enough. We picked our way across the deck, searching for our hatch, careful not to brush against the Darkling's Grisha and guards. The remaining Oprichniki had their guns trained on the empty sands beyond the skiff. We were close enough that I could see the sweat on their brows, their wide eyes. They twitched, jumping at every real or imagined sound. Melanie, they whispered. Ghosts. Only the Darkling seemed unfazed. His face was serene as he surveyed the destruction I'd loosed. I was close enough to strike, but he was still protected by the shadow soldiers. I had an uneasy sensation that he was waiting for something. Suddenly, the Opernik yelled, "Get down!" The people around us dove to the deck, and the air exploded with gunfire. 2 other glass skiffs plowed into view, loaded with Oprichniki. As soon as they came into contact with the light, the skiffs ignited with the glowing violet flame of Lumia. Did you think I would come to meet you unprepared? Alina, the Darkling called over the chaos. Did you think I would not sacrifice an entire fleet of skiffs to this cause? However, many he had sent, only 2 had made it through, but that would be enough to turn the tide. I heard screams, shouting, our soldiers returning fire. A red stain appeared in the sand, and with a lurch I realized that one of our people was bleeding. It could be Vladim, Zoya, Maul. I had to get them out of here. Where were the students? I tried to keep my focus. I couldn't let the light falter. Our forces had canisters of Lumia. They could retreat into the fold, but I knew they wouldn't. Not until I was clear of the Darkling skiff. I crept around the mess, searching for some sign of a trapdoor or a hatch. Then a searing pain cut through my shoulder. I fell backward, crying out. I'd been shot. I sprawled on the deck, feeling my hold on the light falter. Toya's shape flickered into view beside me. I tried to regain control. He disappeared, but through the railing, I could see soldiers and Grisha appearing on the sands. Oprichniki leapt from the other skiffs, moving in for the attack, and the Nishovia surged into the battle. Panic clamored through me as I scrambled for focus. I couldn't feel my right arm. I made myself breathe. Stop huffing like a wild boar. If Adric could summon with one arm, then I could too. Tamar appeared near the prow, vanished, stuttered back into view, and Ashovia slammed her into her. She screamed as it sunk its claws deep into her back. No, I gathered. I gathered my fractured concentration and reached for the cut. Though I had only one good arm to wield it, I wasn't sure that I could hit the Shadow Soldier without wounding Tamar, but I couldn't just watch her die. Then another shape dove into the fray from above. It took me a long second to understand what I was seeing. Nikolai, fangs bared, wings spread. With his talons, he seized the Nishovia that held Tamar and wrenched its head back, forcing it to release her. It skittered and writhed, but Nikolai flew upward and hurled it into the blackness beyond. I heard frenzied shrieks from somewhere in the distance. Volkra. The Shadow Soldier did not reappear. Nikolai swooped back down, barreling into another of the Darkling's Nishovia. I could almost imagine his laugh. Well, if I'm going to be a monster, I might as well be king of the monsters. Then I gasped as my good arm was slammed down to the deck. The Darkling loomed over me, his boot pressing down painfully on my wrist. There you are, he said in his cool, cut-glass voice. Hello, Alina. The light collapsed. Darkness crowded in. It lit only by the eerie flicker of violet flame. I grunted at the Darkling's boot ground down on the bones of my arm. Where are the students? I gritted out. They aren't here. What did you do to them? They're safe and sound back in Kribursk, probably having their lunch. His Nishovia circled around us, forming a perfect protective dome that shifted and wreathed, wings, talons, hands. I knew the threat would be enough. Did you really believe I would endanger Grisha children, even when we've lost so many? I thought he was capable of anything. He wanted me to believe. I realized. When he'd shown me Botkin's and Anakoya's corpses, he'd wanted me to believe in his ruthlessness. Then I remembered his words from so long ago. Make me your villain. I know what you thought. What you've always thought of me. It's so much easier that way, isn't it? To puff yourself up with your own righteousness. I didn't invent your crimes. This wasn't over yet. All I needed was to reach the flint in my sleeve. All I needed was a spark. It might not kill either of us, but it would hurt. It would hurt like crazy, and it might buy the others time. Where is the boy? I have my summoner. I want my tracker too. Maul was still just a tracker to him. Thank the saints. My good hand curled into my sleeve, brushed the edge of the flint. I won't let him be used, I said. Not as leverage. Not as anything. On your back, the faithful dying around you, and yet you remain defiant. He yanked me to my feet. Two Nishovia slid into place to restrain me as the flint slipped out of my grasp. The Darkling shoved the fabric of my coat aside, his hands sliding down my body. My heart sank as his fingers crossed over the first pack of blasting powder. He pulled it from my pocket, then quickly located the second. He sighed. I can feel your intent as you feel mine, Alina. Your hopeless resolve, your martyr's determination. I recognize it now. The tether. An idea came to me then. It was the smallest chance, but I would take it. The Darkling tossed the packs of blasting powder to a Nishovia, who arced away with them into the darkness. He watched me with cool gray eyes as we waited, the sounds of the battle muffled by the whirring of the shadow soldiers around us. A moment later, a shattering boom sounded from somewhere in the distance. The Darkling shook his head. It may well take me another lifetime to break you, Alina, but I'll put my mind to the task. He turned and I acted. Restrained by the Nishovia, I couldn't use the cut, but I wasn't powerless. I twisted my wrists. The violet light of the Lumia bent around me. At the same time, I reached across the tether between us. The Darkling's head jerked up, and for a moment, though I still stood invisible in the grip of the Nishovia, I was staring at him from beside the mast. The vision of the girl before him was whole and unwounded. She raised her arms to deliver the cut. The Darkling didn't stop to think. He reacted. It was a bare second, the brief space between instinct and understanding. But it was enough. His shadow soldiers released me and sprang forward to protect him. I lunged toward the railing and threw myself over the side of the skiff. I landed on my wounded arm, and pain slammed through my body. The Darkling's howl of rage sounded behind me. I knew I'd lost control of the light. That meant I was visible. I made myself keep moving, dragging myself across the sand, away from the violet glow of Lumia. I saw Sun soldiers and Grisha fighting by the illuminated skiffs. Harshaw down, Ruby bleeding. I forced myself to my feet. My head spun. I clutched my wounded arm and lurched into the darkness. I had no sight, no sense of direction. I plunged farther back into the black, trying to make my mind work, to form some kind of plan. I knew the Volco could come for me at any moment, but I couldn't risk the light. Think I berated myself. I berated myself. I was out of ideas. The blasting powders were gone. I couldn't raise the cut. My sleeve was wet with blood, and my footsteps slowed. I had to find someone to heal my arm. I had to regroup. I couldn't just run from the Darkling again the way I'd done the first time on the fold. I'd been running ever since. Alina! I spun. Maul's voice in the dark. Let it be a trick of sound, I thought, but I knew the scholar's blanket had long since been lifted. How had he found me? Stupid question. Maul would always find me. I gasped as he grabbed my wounded arm. Despite the pain and the risk, I summoned a weak wash of light, saw his beautiful face streaked with dirt and blood, and the knife in his hand. I recognized the blade. It was Tamar's. Grisha made. Had she offered it to him for this moment? Had he sought her to ask for it? Maul, don't. This isn't over yet. It is, Alina. I tried to pull away, but he wrapped his hand hard around my wrist, fingers pinching together, the sharp jolt of power moving through both of us, calling me, demanding that I step through that door. With his other hand, he forced my fingers through the knife's grip. The light wavered. No! Don't let it all be for nothing, Alina. Please! An agonized scream rose over the clamor of the battle. It sounded like Zoya. Save them, Alina. Don't let me live knowing I might have stopped this. Maul, save them. This once, let me carry you. His gaze locked on mine. End this, he said. His grip tightened. There is no end to our story. I would never know if it was greed or selflessness that moved my hand. With Maul's fingers guiding mine, I shoved the knife up and into his chest. The momentum jerked me forward, and I stumbled. I pulled back, the knife falling from both of our hands, blood spilling from the wound, but he kept his hold on my wrist. Maul, I sobbed. He coughed and blood burbled from his lips. He swayed forward. I nearly toppled as I clutched him to me. As his hold on my wrist so tight, I thought the bones might snap. He gasped. Oh, a wet rattle. His full weight slumped against me, dragging me down, fingers clenched, pressed against my skin, as if he were taking my pulse. I knew when he was gone. For a moment, all was silent. I held breath, and then everything exploded into white fire. A roar filled my ears, an avalanche of sound that shook the sands and made the very air vibrate. I screamed as power flooded through me, as I burned, consumed from the inside. I was a living star. I was combustion. I saw a new sun born to shatter air and eat the earth. I am ruination. The world trembled, dissolved, crashed in on itself. And then the power was gone. My eyes flew open. Thick darkness surrounded me. My ears were ringing. I was on my knees. My hands found Maul's body, the damp crumple of his blood-soaked shirt. I threw up my hands, calling the light. Nothing happened. I tried again, reaching for the power and finding only absence. I heard a shriek from above. The Volca were circling. I could see bursts of inferni flame. The dim shapes of soldiers fighting in the violet glow of the skiffs. Somewhere, Toya and Tamar were calling my name. Maul! My throat was raw. I didn't know my own voice. I sought the light as I had once done deep in the belly of the White Cathedral, searching for any faint tendril, but this was different. I could feel the wound inside me, the gap where something whole and right had been. I wasn't broken. I was empty. My fist bunched in Maul's shirt. Help me, I gasped. What is infinite? The universe and the greed of men. What lesson was this? What sick joke? When the Darkling had toyed with the power at the heart of creation, the fold had been his reward, a place where his power was meaningless, an abomination that would keep him and his country in servitude for hundreds of years. Was this my punishment then? Was Morozovia truly mad? Or was he just a failure? Someone help! I screamed. Toya and Tamar were racing toward me, Zoya trailing behind, their bodies lit by glass canisters of Lumia. Toya was limping. Zoya had a burn along one side of her face. Tamar was practically covered in blood from the wounds the Nishovia had given her. They all stopped short when they saw Maul. Bring him back, I cried. Toya and Tamar went to their knees beside him, but I saw the look they exchanged. Alina, said Tamar. Please, I sobbed. Bring him back to me. Tamar opened Maul's mouth, attempting to force air into his lungs. Toya placed one hand on Maul's chest, applying pressure to the wound and trying to restore the beat of his heart. We need more light, he said. A choked laugh escaped me. I held up my hands, pleading with the light and with any saint who had ever lived. It was no good. The gesture felt false. It was a pantomime. There was nothing there. I don't understand, I cried as I pressed my wet cheek to Maul's. His skin was already cooling. Bagger had warned me. You may not be able to survive the sacrifice that Mursos requires. But what was the point of this sacrifice? Had he lived only to be a lesson in the price of greed? Was that the truth of Morozova's madness? Some kind of cruel equation that took all our love and loss and added them up to nothing? It was too much. The hate and pain and grief overwhelmed me. If I had my power back for even a second, I would have burned the world to a cinder. Then I saw it, a light in the distance, a gleaming blade that pierced the dark. Before I could make sense of it, another appeared. a bright point that became two broad beams, sweeping high and wild above me. A torrent of light burst from the darkness, just a few feet from me. As my eyes adjusted, I saw Vladim, his mouth open in shock and confusion as light poured from his palms. I turned my head and saw them sparking to life. One by one across the fold, like stars appearing in a twilight sky, Soldat Soul and Uprichniki were weapons forgotten. Their faces baffled, awed, terrified, and bathed in light. The Darkling's words came back to me, spoken on a ship that sailed the icy waters of the Bone Road. Morozova was a strange man. He was a bit like you, drawn to the ordinary and the weak. He'd had an Otkazia wife. He'd nearly lost an Otskia child. He'd thought himself alone in the world, alone in his power. Now I understood. I saw what he had done. This was the gift of the three amplifiers. Power multiplied 1,000 times, but not in one person. How many new summoners had just been created? How far had Morozova's power reached? The arcs and the cascades of light blossomed around me, a bright garden glowing in this unnatural night. The beams met, and where they crossed, the darkness burned away. The shrieks of the Volca erupted around me as the fold began to unravel. It was a miracle, and I didn't care. The saints would keep their miracles. The Grisha could keep their long lives and their lessons. Maul was dead. How? I looked up. The Darkling stood behind us, stunned, talking in the impossible sight of the fold coming apart around us. This can't be. Not without the Firebird. The third... He stopped short as his eyes settled on Maul's body, the blood on my hands. It can't be, he repeated. Even now, as the world we knew remained in bursts and flashes of light. He couldn't comprehend what Maul truly was. He wouldn't. What power is this? He demanded. The Darkling stalked toward us, shadows pooling in his palms, his creatures swirling around him. The twins drew their weapons. Without thinking, I lifted my hands, reaching for the light. Nothing happened. The Darkling stared. He dropped his arms. The skins of darkness faded. No, he said, bewildered, shaking his head. No, this isn't... What have you done? Keep working, I ordered the twins. Alina! Bring him back to me, I repeated. I wasn't making some sense. I knew that. They didn't have Morozova's power, but Maul could make rabbits out of rocks. He could find true north standing on his head. He would find his way back to me again. I lurched to my feet, and the Darkling strode toward me. His hands went to my throat. No, he whispered. Only then did I realize the collar had fallen away. I looked down. It lay in pieces beside Maul's body. My wrist was bare. The fetter had broken too. This isn't right, he said. In his voice I heard desperation. A new and unfamiliar anguish. His fingers skimmed my neck, cupped my face. I felt no surge of surety. No light stirred within me to answer his call. His gray eyes searched mine, confused, nearly frightened. You are meant to be like me. You're nothing now. He dropped his hands. I saw the realization strike him. He was truly alone, and he always would be. I saw the emptiness enter his eyes, felt the yawning void inside him stretch wider, an infinite wasteland. The calm left him, all that cool certainty. He cried out in his rage. He spread his arms wide, calling the darkness. The Nishovia scattered like a flock of birds, flushed from a hedge and turned to Soldat Soul and Oprichniki alike, cutting them down, snuffing out the beams of light that blazed from their bodies. I knew there was no bottom to the Darkling's pain. He was just he would just keep falling and falling. Mercy. Had I ever really understood it? Had I actually believed I knew what it was to suffer? To forgive? Mercy, I thought, for the stag, for the Darkling, for us all. If we'd still been bound by that tether, he might have sensed that what I was about to do. My fingers twitched in the sleeve of my coat, curling a scrape of shadow around the blade of my knife. The knife I had plucked from the sands, wet with Maul's blood. This was the only power that was left to me, one that had never really been mine. An echo, a joke, a carnival trick. It's something you took from him. I don't need to be Grisha, I whispered, to wield Grisha's steel. With one swift movement, I drove a shadow-wrapped blade deep into the Darkling's heart. He made a soft sound, little more than an exhalation. He looked down at the hilt protruding from his chest, then back up at me. He frowned, took a step, tottered slightly. He righted himself. A single laugh burst from his lips, and a fine spray of blood settled over his chin. Like this? His legs faltered. He tried to stop his descent, but his arm gave way and he crumpled, rolling to his back. It's simple enough. Like calls to like. The Darkling's own power. Morozova's own blood. Blue sky, he said. I looked. In the distance, I saw it. A pale glimmer, almost completely obscured by the black mist of the fold. The Volker was swooping away from it, looking for someplace to hide. Alina, he breathed. I knelt beside him. The Nishovia had left off their attacks. They circled and clattered above us, unsure of what to do. I thought I glimpsed Nikolai among them, arcing toward the patch of blue. Alina, the Darkling repeated, his fingers seeking mine. I was surprised to find fresh tears filling my eyes. He reached up and brushed his knuckles over the wetness on my cheek. The smallest smile touched his blood-stained lips. Someone to mourn me. He dropped his hand, as if the weight were too much. No grave, he gasped, his hand tightening on mine. For them to desecrate. All right, I said. The tears came harder. There will be nothing left. He shuddered. His eyes drooped. Once more, he said. Speak my name once more. He was ancient. I knew that. But in this moment, he was just a boy. Brilliant. Blessed with too much power. Burdened by eternity. Alexander. His eyes fluttered shut. Don't let me be alone, he murmured, and then he was gone. A sound like a great sigh rushed over us, lifting my hair. The Nishovia blew apart, scattering like ashes in wind, leaving startled soldiers and Grisha staring at the places where they'd been. I heard a wrenching cry and looked up in time to see Nikolai's wings dissolve, darkness spilling from him in black wisps as he plummeted to the gray sand. Zoya ran to him, trying to slow his fall with an updraft. I knew I should move. I should do something. But I couldn't seem to make my legs work. I slumped between me, Maul and the Darkling. The last of Morozova's line. I was bleeding from my bullet wound. I touched the bare skin at my neck. It felt naked. Dimly, I was aware of the Darkling's Grisha retreating. Some of the Obrichniki went too, the light still flowing from them in uncontrollable fits and starts. I didn't know where they were going. Maybe back to Kribursk, to warn their compatriots that their master had fallen. Maybe they were just running. I didn't care. I heard Toya and Tamar whispering back and forth. I couldn't make out the words, but the resignation in their voices was clear enough. Nothing left, I said softly, feeling the emptiness inside me, the emptiness everywhere. The Soldat Soul were cheering, letting light blaze around them in glorious arcs as they burned the fold away. Some of them had climbed up on the Darkling's glass skiffs. Others had formed a line, bringing the beams of light together, sending a cascade of sunlight speeding through the thinning scrapes of darkness, unraveling the fold in a rippling wave. They were crying, laughing, joyous in their triumph, so loud that I almost didn't hear it. A soft rasp, fragile, impossible. I tried to keep it out, but hope came at me hard, a longing so acute I knew its end would break me. Tamar sobbed. Toya swore, and there it was again, the steady, miraculous sound of Maul's drawing breath. And that is the end of chapter 17. We have 18 and the after. So, let me see. This will put me at 411. This gets me finished at 417. Okay. We are just about done here. Alright. Well, I was hoping to finish this, do a super read tonight. Well, we did get pretty far, almost an hour and a half in it. And like I said, my wife will be here any moment, so I could go on for another 30 minutes, maybe. Because all that's left is 40 pages. I've got 40 pages left to read in this book. So what I'll do, since there's only 40 pages left, I'm going to go ahead and let me see. Yeah, I only got 40 pages left, so I'll try to. Let me see. Debating how I'm going to do this. Okay. It's only that little bit left. So I'll go ahead and finish the book tonight. And just finish it and get done with it tonight. And then and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be doing a book comparison. Make it TV versus book. Not tonight, obviously, but I'm going to do it sometime this coming week. So I hope you all are enjoying tonight's video. I only have a little bit left in here. So I'll go ahead and because we're almost done. Because I don't want to wait too much longer. So yeah, I'll go ahead and finish. We'll finish tonight. Chapter 18. We finished chapter 17, and now we'll get to chapter 18. They took us out of the fold in one of the Darkling's skiffs. Zoya appropriated the battered glass vessel with effortless command, then kept the curious soul distracted at Zoya and Tamar. As Zoya and Toya and Tamar loaded us onto the deck. Hidden beneath heavy coats and folded kefta, the Darkling's body was wrapped in the blue robes. One of his fallen inferni, I made him a promise, and I intended to keep it. Okay, give me 1 second. Give me 1 quick second. Okay. Sorry. Let me go ahead and continue reading. Alright. The Squallers and Zoya, Nadia, and Adric, all of them alive and as whole as they'd been when the battle began, filled the black sails and carried us over the dead sands as fast as their power would allow. I lay next to Maul. He was still in terrible pain, drifting in and out of consciousness. Toya continued to work on him, checking his pulse and his breathing. Somewhere in the skiff, I heard Nikolai talking, his voice husky and damaged by whatever dark thing had used him. I wanted to go to him, see his face, make sure he was all right. He must have broken bones after that fall, but I'd lost a lot of blood, and I found myself slipping away, my weary mind eager for oblivion. As my eyes began to slide shut, I grabbed Toya's hand. I died here. Do you understand? He frowned. He thought I was delirious, but I needed to make him hear. This was my martyrdom, Toya. I died here today. Secta Alina, he said softly, and pressed a kiss on my knuckles, a courtly gesture, like a gentleman at a dance. I prayed to all the real saints that
New hand-breaded chicken tenders from Jollibee.
that he
The next
understood.
generation of crispy, juicy tenders.
In the end, my friends did a good job of my death, and an even better job of Nikolai's resurrection. They got us back to Domikiana and stashed us in the barn, tucked away with the cider presses in case the Soldat soul returned. They got Nikolai cleaned up, cut his hair, filled him with sugary tea and stale bread. Genya even found him a First Army uniform. Within hours, he was headed to Kribursk, flanked by the twins, along with Nadia and Zoya, dressed in blue keftas, the one from the dead. The story they concocted was simple. He'd been the Darkling's prisoner, slated for execution on the fold, but he'd escaped, and the Sun Summoners, and with the Sun Summoners' help, managed to vanquish the Darkling. Few people knew the truth of what had happened. The battle had been a confusion of violence waged in near darkness, and I suspected the Darklings Grisha and Oprichniki would be too busy running or begging for royal pardons to dispute this new version of events. It was a good story with a tragic ending. The Sun Summoner had given her life to save Ravka and its new king. Most of my hours back at Tomikiana were a blur. The smell of apples, the rustle of pigeons in the eaves, the rise and fall of Maul's breath beside me. At some point, Genya came to look in on us, and I thought I must be dreaming. The scars on her face were still there, but most of the black ridges were gone. Your shoulder, too, she said with a smile. Scarred, but not nearly so frightening. Your eye? I asked. Gone for good, but I've grown rather fond of my patch. I think it lends me a certain reckishness. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Misha was standing in front of me with flour in his hands. What were you baking? I asked, my words blurry at the edges. Ginger cake. Not apple? I'm sick of apples. Do you want to stir the icing? I remembered nodding, then fell back to sleep. It wasn't until late that night that Zoya and Tamar came to check on us, bringing news from Kribursk. It seemed that the power of the amplifiers had reached all the way to the dry docks. The explosion had knocked Grisha and dock workers from their feet, and mayhem had erupted as light started to pour from every Otkazia within range. As the fold began to disintegrate, they dared to step past its shores and join the destruction. Some of them had picked up guns and started hunting Volcra, rounding them up in the few remaining scraps of the fold and putting them to death. It was said some of the monsters had escaped, braving the light to seek deep shadows elsewhere. Now, between the dock workers, the Soldat Soul, and the Obrichniki, who had not fled, all that remained of the unsea were a few dark wisps that hung in the air or trailed over the ground like lost creatures separated from the herd. When rumors of the Darkling's death had reached Kribursk, the military camp had descended into chaos, and it strode Nikolai Lantsov. He installed himself in the royal quarters, began assembling First Army captains and Grisha commanders, and simply starting giving orders. He mobilized all the remaining units of the army to secure the borders, sent messages to the coast to rally Sturmhund's fleet, and had apparently managed it all on no sleep and 2 fractured ribs. No one else would have had the ability to let alone the nerve. Certainly not a younger son, and rumored. Certainly not a younger son. But Nikolai had been training for his entire life, and I knew he had a gift for the impossible. How is he? I asked Tamar. She paused and said, haunted. There's a difference in him, though I'm not sure anyone else would notice. Maybe, objected Zoya, but I've never seen anything like it. If he gets any more charming, men and women may start lying down in the street for the privilege of being stepped on by the new Rufkin king. However, did you resist him? Good question, Maul murmured from beside me. Turns out I don't care for emeralds, I said. Zoya rolled her eyes. Or royal blood, blinding charisma, tremendous wealth. You can stop now, said Maul. I leaned my head against his shoulder. Those are all nice enough, but my real passion is lost causes. Or just one really Beznako. My lost cause, found again. I am surrounded by fools, Zoya said, but she was smiling. Before Tamar and Zoya returned to the main house, Tamar checked our injuries. Maul was weak, but given what he'd been through, that was to be expected. Tamar had healed the bullet wound in my shoulder, and aside from being a bit shaky and sore, I felt good as new. At least that was what I was. I what that was what I told them. I could feel the ache absence, where my power had been like a phantom limb. I dozed on the mattress they dragged into the barn, and I woke. And when I woke, Maul was lying on his bed, on his side, watching me. He was pale, and his blue eyes seemed almost too bright. I reached out and traced the scar that ran along his jaw, the one he'd gotten in Ferda when he'd first been hunting the stag. What did you see? I asked. When I died. I gave him a gentle shove. He winced. I saw Ilya Morozova on the back of a unicorn playing a, a balalaika. Very funny. He eased back and carefully tucked his arm under his head. I didn't see anything. All I remember is pain. The knife felt like it was on fire, like it was carving my heart from my chest. Then nothing, just darkness. You were gone, I said with a shiver. And then my voice broke. He put out his arm, and I laid my head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb the bandages on his chest. I'm sorry, he said. There were times I wished your power away, but I never wanted this. I'm grateful to be alive, I said. The fold is gone. You're safe. It just hurts. I felt petty. Harshaw was dead, and so were half of the Soldat Soul, including Ruby. Then there were the others: Sergei, Marie, Paja, Vidyar, Botkin, Bagra. So many lost to this war. The list stretched on and on. Loss is loss, Small said. You have the right to grieve. I stared up at the barn's wooden beams. Even the shred of darkness I'd commanded had abandoned me. That power had belonged to the Darkling, and it had left this world with him. I feel empty. Maul was quiet for a long moment, then said, I feel it too. I pushed up on my elbow. His gaze was far away. I won't know until I try to track, but I feel different. I used to just know things. Even lying here, I could have sensed deer in the field. A bird resting on a branch.
My orchid 2 hearts.
Maybe a mouse burrowing in the wall. I never thought about it. But now this kind of silence. Give me one moment, please. Yeah, sweetie. No, it was recording. It's okay. Yay. That was good. Hmm. Yeah. I'm sure you're not the only one that's done that. Yeah. Why don't you wait till 10 o'clock? Yeah. I know. Okay. Well, see you in a bit, my love. Bye, my love. Okay. Sorry. My wife had called back. She's on her way back. But anywho, let's try to finish this tonight. That way I can be ready for our next book, which will be Westfallen. Brand new series that started last year. and I'm gonna try to be consistent with it this year. I'll get to that book, and I'm gonna wait for book two, which comes out in September of this year. So I'm actually pretty curious about how this book's gonna go, and we'll see how it turns out. And it's gonna be in honor of my grandpa. This book series is gonna be in honor of my grandpa. But let's go ahead and continue reading Ruin and Rising. We are almost there. Let's see. Maul was quiet for a long moment, then said, I feel it too. Oh, let's see. Blah, blah, blah. Loss. I wondered how Toy and Timor had brought Maul back. I'd been willing to simply call it a miracle. Now I thought I understood. Maul had possessed two lives, but only one was rightfully his. The other was stolen, an inheritance wrought from Murzost, snatched from the making at the heart of the world. It was the force that had animated Morozova's daughter when her human life had gone. The power that had reverberated through Maul's bones. His blood had been thick with it, and that purloined bit of creation was what had made him such a remarkable tracker. It had bound him to every living thing, like calls to like. And now it was gone. The life stolen by Morozova and given to his daughter had reached its end. The life Maul had been born with, fragile, fragile, mortal, temporary, was his alone. Loss. This was the price the world had demanded for balance. But Morozova couldn't have known that the person to unlock the secrets of these amplifiers wouldn't be some ancient Grisha who had lived 1,000 years and grown weary of his power. He couldn't have known that it would all come down to two orphans from Karamzin. Maul took my hand, curling his fingers in mine, and pressed it to his chest. Do you think you could be happy? He asked, with a used-up tracker. I smiled at that. Cocky Maul, charming, brave, and dangerous. Was that doubt in his voice? I kissed him once, gently. If you can be happy with someone who stuck a knife in your chest, it helped. I helped, and I told you I can handle a bad mood. I didn't know what came next or who I was supposed to be. I owned nothing, not even the borrowed clothes on my back. And yet, lying there, I realized I wasn't afraid. After all I'd been through, there was no fear left in me. Sadness, gratitude, maybe even hope. But the fear that had eaten up my pain and challenge, the saint was gone. The summoner too. I was just a girl again. But this girl didn't owe her strength to fate or chance or a grand destiny. I'd been born with my power, the rest I'd earned. Maul, you'll have to be careful. The story of the amplifiers could leak out. People might still think you have power. He shook his head. Malyan Ortsev died with you, he said, his words echoing my thoughts closely enough to raise the hair on my arms. That life is over. Maybe I'll be smarter in the next one. I snorted. We'll see. We're going to have to choose our new names, you know. Misha is already making a list of suggestions. Oh, saints. You have nothing to complain about. Apparently I am to be Dmitri Dumpkin. Suits you. I should warn you that I'm keeping a tab of all of your insults so that I can reward you when I'm healed. Easy with the threats, Dumpkin. Maybe I'll tell the Uprat all about your miraculous recovery, and he'll turn you into a saint too. He can try, said Maul. I don't intend to waste my days in holy pursuits. No? No, he said as he drew me closer. I have to spend the rest of my life finding ways to deserve a certain white-haired girl. She's very prickly, occasionally puts goose droppings in my shoe, or tries to kill me. Sounds fatiguing, I managed as his lips met mine. She's worth it. And one day, maybe she'll let me chase her into a chapel. I shuddered. I don't like chapels. I did tell Anakuya I would marry you. I laughed. You remember that? Alina, he said, and kissed the scar on my palm. I remember everything. It was time to leave Tomikia behind. We'd had only one night to recover. But news of the destruction of the fold was spreading fast, and soon the farm's owners might return. And even if I was no longer the Sun Summoner, there were still things I needed to do before I could bury Sancta Elena forever. Genya brought us clean clothes. Maul limped behind the cider presses to change while she helped me put on a simple blouse and the sarafan that went over it. They were peasant clothes, not even military. She'd once woven gold through my hair at the little palace, but now a more radical change was necessary. She used a pot of hematite and a clutch of shiny rooster feathers so temporarily alter its distinctive white color. Then tied a kerchief around my head for good measure. Maul returned wearing a tunic and trousers and a simple coat. He had on a black wool cap with a narrow brim. Genya wrinkled her nose. You look like a farmer. I've looked worse, he peered at me. Is your hair red? Temporarily. And she's almost pulling it off, Genya added, and sailed from the barn. The effects would fade in a few days without her assistance. Genya and David would travel separately to meet with Grisha gathering at the military camp in Kribursk. They'd offered to bring Misha with them, but he elected to go with me and Maul. He claimed we needed looking after. We made sure that his golden sunburst was safely hidden away, and his pockets were stuffed with cheese for Oncat. Then we headed into the gray sands of what had once been the fold. It was easy to blend in with the crowds crossing to and from Ravka. There were families, groups of soldiers, nobles, and peasants. Children climbed over the ruins of sand skiffs. People gathered in spontaneous parties. They kissed and hugged, handed around bottles of kvass and fried bread stuffed with raisins. They greeted each other with shouts of unity. Amid the celebrations, there were pockets of grief. Silence reigned in the crumbling remains of what had been Novokribursk. Most of the buildings had slumped into dust. There were only dim suggestions of spaces where the streets had been, and everything had been bleached a nearly colorless gray. The round stone fountain that had been stood at the center of the town looked like a crescent moon, eaten away wherever the fold's dark power had touched it. Old men poked at the old ruins and muttered to each other. Even beyond the fallen town's edges, mourners laid flowers on the wrecks of skiffs and built little altars in their holes. Everywhere, I saw people wearing the double eagle, carrying banners and waving Ravkan flags. Girls wore pale blue and gold ribbons in their hair, and I heard whispers of the tortures the brave young prince had endured at the Darkling's hands. I heard my name too. Pilgrims were already flooding into the fold to see the miracle that had occurred, and to offer up prayers to Sancta Elena. Once again, vendors had begun setting up carts littered with what they claimed were my finger bones, and my face stared back at me from the painted surfaces of wooden icons. It wasn't quite me, though. This was a prettier girl, with round cheeks and serene brown eyes, the antlers of Morozova's collar resting on her slender neck. Alina of the Fold. No one spared us a second glance. We weren't nobles. We weren't Second Army. We weren't this strange new class of summoner soldier. We were anonymous. We were tourists. In Krabursk, the, the party was in full swing. The dry docks were ablaze with colored lanterns. People sang and drank aboard the sand skiffs. They crowded on the steps of the barracks and raided the mess tent for food. I glimpsed the yellow flag of the documents tent, and though some part of me ached to return there, to take the old familiar smells of ink and paper, I couldn't risk the possibility that one of the cartographers would recognize me. The brothels and taverns in town were doing a booming business. An impromptu dance was being held in the central square, though just down the street a crowd had gathered at the old church to read the names written on its walls and light candles for the dead. I paused to light one for Harshaw, then another and another. He would have liked the flames. Tamar had found a room for us at one of the more respectable inns. I left Maul and Misha there with promises to return that night. The news coming out of Oz Alta was still a tangle, and we hadn't had word of Misha's mother yet. I knew he must be hopeful, but he hadn't said a word about it. Just solemnly vowed to watch over Maul in my absence. Read him religious parables, I whispered to Misha. He loves that. I barely dodged the pillow Maul threw across the room. I didn't go directly to the royal barracks, but took a route that led me past where the darkling silk pavilion had once stood. I'd assumed that he would rebuild it, but the field was empty, and when I reached the Lansoff quarters, I quickly understood why. The darkling had taken up residence there. He'd hung black banners from the windows, and the carving of the double eagle above the doors had been replaced with a sun in eclipse. Now workmen were pulling down the black silks and replacing them with Rovkin blue and gold. An awning had been set up to catch plaster as a soldier took a massive hammer to the stone symbol above the door, shattering it to dust. A cheer went up from the crowd. I couldn't share in their excitement. For all his crimes, the Darkling had vowed Ravka, and he wanted its love in return. I found a guard near the entry and asked after Timar Kurbatar. He looked down his nose at me, seeing nothing but a scrawny peasant girl, and for a moment I heard the Darkling say, "You're nothing now." The girl I'd once been would have believed him. The girl I'd become wasn't in the mood. "What exactly are you waiting for?" I snapped. The soldier blinked and jumped to attention. A few minutes later, Timur and Toya were jogging down the steps to me. Toya swept me in her huge arms. "Our sister," he explained to the curious guard. "Our sister?" hissed Timur as we entered the royal barracks. "She doesn't look anything like us. Remind me never to let you work intelligence." "I have better things to do than trade in whispers," he said with dignity. "Besides, she is our sister." I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, "Did I come at a bad time?" Tamar shook her head. "Nikolai ended meetings early so people could attend the..." She trailed off. I nodded. They led me down a hall decorated with weapons of war and charts of the fold. Those maps would have to change now. I wondered if anything would ever grow on those deadened sands. Will you stay with them?" asked Tamar. Nikolai had to be desperate for people he could trust around. He could just trust around him. For a while, Nadia wants to. And there are still some members of the 22nd alive, too. Nevsky? She shook her head. Did Stig make it out of the spinning wheel? She shook her head again. There were others to ask after, casualty lists I dreaded reading, but that would have to wait. I might stay on, said Toya. Depends on Toya, his sister said sharply. Toya flushed and shrugged. Just depends. We reached a set of heavy double doors, their handles the heads of two screaming eagles. Timar knocked. The room was dark, lit only by the blaze of a fire in the grate. It took me a moment to pick Nikolai in the gloom. He was seated in front of the fire, his polished boots propped up on a cushioned stool. A plate of food sat beside him, along with a bottle of kvass, though I knew he preferred brandy. We'll be outside, said Timar. Timar said. All at the sound of the door shutting, Nikolai started. He jumped to his feet and bowed. Forgive me, he said. I was lost in thought. Then he grinned and added, unfamiliar territory. He leaned back again against the door. A lapse, covered with charm, but a lapse nonetheless. You don't have to do that, but I do. His smile slipped. He gestured to the chairs by the fire. Join me? I crossed the room. The long table was littered with documents and sheaves of letters emblazoned with the royal seal. A book lay open on the chair. He moved it aside and we sat. What are you reading? He glanced on at the title. One of Kamensky's military histories. Really? I just wanted to look at the words. He ran his fingers over the cover. His hands were marred with nicks and cuts. Though my scars had faded, the darkling had marked Nikolai in a different way. Faint black lines still ran along each of his fingers where claws had shoved their way through his skin. He would have to pass them off as signs of the torture he'd endured as the Darkling's prisoner. In a way, it was true. At least the rest of the markings seemed to have faded. I couldn't read, he continued. When I would see signs in store windows writing on crates. I couldn't understand them, but I remembered enough to know that they were more than scratches on a wall. I settled deeper into the chair. What else do you remember? His hazel eyes were distant. Too much. I could still feel that darkness inside me. I keep thinking it will go, but I know, I said. It's better now, but it's still there. Like a shadow next to my heart. I didn't know what that might imply about the Darkling's power, and I didn't want to consider it. Maybe it will fade in time. He pinched the bridge of his nose between two fingers. This isn't what people want of a king. What they expect from me. Give yourself a chance to heal. Everyone is watching. They need reassurance. It won't be long before the Verdans or the Shu try to move against me. What will you do? My fleet is intact. Thank the saints in Privyet, he said, referring to the officer he'd left in command when he'd given up the mantle of Sturmund. They should be able to neutralize Ferda for a time. And there are supply ships already waiting in the harbor with deliveries of weapons. I've sent word to every operational military outpost. We'll do our best to secure the borders. I'll leave for Alta tomorrow, and I have emissaries en route to try to bring the militias back under the king's flag. He gave a slight laugh. My flag. Okay. I smiled. I smiled. Just think of all the bowing and scraping in your future. I smiled. Sorry. All hail the Pirate King, Privateer. Why dance around it? Crazy King is more likely. Actually, I said, they're already calling you Coral Rizni. I had heard it whispered in the streets of Kribursk. King of Scars. He looked up sharply. Do you think they know? I doubt it. But you're used to rumors, Nikolai, and this might be a good thing. He raised a brow. I know you love to be loved, I said, but a little fear couldn't hurt either. Did the duckling teach you that? And you? I seem to remember a certain story about a Verdun captain's fingers and a hungry hound. Next time, warn me when you're paying attention. I'll talk less. Now, you tell me. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Then he frowned. I should warn you. The apparat will be there tonight. I sat up straighter. You pardoned the priest? I had to. I need his support. Will you offer him a place at court? We're in negotiations, he said bitterly. I could offer him all the information I had on the apparat, but I suspected what would help most was the location of the White Cathedral. Unfortunately, Maul was the only one who might have been able to lead us back there, and I wasn't sure that was a possibility anymore. Nikolai gave the bottle of kvass an idle turn. It's not too late, he said. You could stay. You could come back with me to the Grand Palace. And do what? Teach? Help me rebuild the Second Army? Rusticate by the lake? This was what Toya had been alluding to. He'd hoped I might return to Al's Alta. It hurt to even think about. I shook my head. I'm not Grisha, and I'm certainly not a noble. I don't belong at court. You could stay with me, he said quietly. He gave the bottle another turn. I still need a queen. I rose from my chair and nudged his booted feet aside, settling on the little stool to look up at him. I am not the Sun Summoner anymore, Nikolai. I'm not even Alina Starkov. I don't want to return to court. But you understand this thing? He tapped his chest. I did. Morzast. Darkness. You could hate it and hunger for it at the same time. Okay. I'd only be a liability. Power is an alliance, I reminded him. I do love it when you quote me, he sighed. If only I weren't so wise. I reached into my pocket and set the Lansoff emerald on Nikolai's knee. Genya had given it back to me when we'd left Tomikiana. He picked it up, turned it over. Its stone flushed green in the firelight. A shoe princess, then? A buxom Verdun? A Kurt Magnet's daughter? He held out the ring. Keep it. I stared at him. How much of that kvass have you drunk? None. Keep it, please. Nikolai, I can't. I owe you, Alina. Ravka owes you. This and more. Do good works or commission an opera house, or just take it out and gaze at it longingly. When you think of the handsome prince you might have made your own. For the second, I favor the latter option, preferably paired with copious tears and the recitation of bad poetry. I laughed. He took my hand and pressed the ring into it. Take it and build something new. I turned the ring over in my hand. I'll think about it. He rolled his eyes. What is your aversion to the word yes? I felt tears rising and had to blink them away. Thank you. He leaned back. We were friends, weren't we? Not just allies? Don't be a smart mouth, Nikolai. We are friends. I gave him a hard tap on the knee. Now, you and I are going to settle some things about the Second Army. And then we're going to watch me burn. On our way to the dry docks, I slipped away and found Genya. She and David were cloistered in a fabricator tent on the east side of the camp. When I handed her the sealed letter, marked with the Rufkin double eagle, she paused, holding it gingerly, as if the heavy paper were dangerous to the touch. She ran her thumb over the wax seal, fingers quaking slightly. Is it? It's a pardon. She tore it open, and then clutched it to her. David didn't look up from his work table when he said, "Are we going to jail?" "No, not just yet," she said. She blushed away a tear. "Thank you." Then she frowned as I handed her the second letter. "What is this?" "A job offer." It had taken some convincing, but in the end Nikolai had seen the sense in my suggestions. I cleared my throat. Ravka still needs its Grisha, and Grisha still need a safe haven in the world. I want you to lead the Second Army, along with David and Zoya. Zoya, are you punishing me? She's powerful, and I think she has it in her to be a good leader, or she'll make your life a nightmare. Possibility, both. Why us? The Darkling is gone, and so is the Sun Summoner. Now the Grisha can lead themselves, and I want all the orders represented. Earthwalkie, Martyralkie, and you, Corporalkie. I'm not really a cripple, Nick, Alina. When you had the chance, you chose red, and I hope that those divisions won't matter so much if the Grisha are led by their own. All of you are strong. All of you know what it is to be seduced by power or status or knowledge. Besides, they're all heroes. You're all heroes. That follows Zoya, maybe even David. Yes, distractedly. Nothing. You're going to have to go to more meetings. I hate meetings, he grumbled. Alina, she said, I'm not sure they'll follow me. You make them follow you. I touched her shoulder, brave and unbreakable. A slow smile spread over her face. Then she winked, and marvelous. I grinned. So you accept? I accept. I hugged her tight. She laughed, then tugged at a lock of hair that had slipped free from my kerchief. Already fading, she said. Should we freshen you up? Tomorrow. Tomorrow, she agreed. I embraced her once more, then slipped outside into the last scrapes of daylight. I wended my way back through camp, following the crowd past the dry docks and into the sands of what had been the Unsea. The sun had almost set and dusk was falling, but it was impossible to miss the pyre, a massive mound of birches, their branches tangled like white limbs. A shiver passed through me as I saw the girl laid to rest atop it, her hair spread around her head in a white halo. She wore a kefta of blue and gold, and Rosa's collar curled around her throat. The stag's antlers, a silvery gray against her skin. Whatever wire or fabricator craft held the pieces together had been hidden from view. My eyes roved over her face, my face. Genya had done an extraordinary job. The shape was just right, the tilt of the nose, the angle of the jaw, the tattoo on her cheek was gone. There was almost nothing left of Ruby, the soldat soul who would have lived to be a summoner if she hadn't perished on the fold. She died an ordinary girl. I'd balked at the idea of using her body this way, troubled troubled that her family would have nothing to bury. It had been Toya who convinced me. She believed Alina. Even if you don't, let this be her final act of faith. Beside Ruby, the Darkling lay in his black kefta. Who hadn't tended him, I wondered, feeling an ache rise in my throat. Who had combed his dark hair back so neatly from his forehead, who had folded his graceful hands on his chest. Some of the crowd were complaining that the Darkling had no business sharing a pirate with a saint. But this felt right to me, and the people needed to see an end to it. The remaining soldat soul had gathered around the pyre, their bare backs and chests emblazoned with tattoos. Vladimir was there too, head bowed, the raised flesh of his brand outlined by firelight. Around them, people wept. Nikolai stood at the periphery, immaculate in his first army uniform, the apparat at his side. I pulled my shawl up. Nikolai's gaze touched mine briefly from across the circle. He gave the signal. The apparat raised his hands. The inferni struck their flints. Flame leapt in bright arcs, circling and diving between the birches like darting birds, licking at the tinder until it smoldered and caught. The fire grew, flames shimmering the shaking leaves of a great golden tree. Around me, the moans and weeping of the crowd grew louder. Sancta, they cried. Sancta Alina! My eyes burned with the smoke. The smell was quickly sweet. Sancta Alina! No one knew his name to curse or extol, so I spoke it softly beneath my breath. Alexander, I whispered. A boy's name, given up, almost forgotten. That is the end of chapter 18. And now we only have a few pages left. I think this is 113. 4 pages. Easy peasy. We'll read these last 4 pages and then we're done. A chapel stood on the coast of West Ravka, south of Oz Curvo. On the shores of the true sea, it was a quiet place where the waves came nearly to the door. The whitewashed walls were laden with shells, and the dome that floated above the altar looked less like the heavens than the deep blue well of the sea. There was no grand betrothal, no contract or false ransom. The girl and the boy had no families to fuss over them. To parade them through the nearby town or honor them with feasts. The bride wore no kokochnik, no dress of gold. Their only witnesses were an orange cat that slunk between the pews and a child, motherless now too, who carried a wooden sword. He had to stand on a chair to hold the driftwood crowns above their heads as the blessings were said. The names they gave were false ones, though the vows they made were true. There were still wars, and there were still orphans, but the building that rose over the ruin that had been Karamzin was nothing like the one before. It was not a duke's home, full of things that shouldn't be touched. It was a place for children. The piano in the music room was left uncovered. The larder door was never locked. A lantern was always lit in the dormitories to keep away the dark. The staff did not approve. The students were too boisterous. Too much money was wasted on sugar for tea, on coal in the winter, on books that contained nothing but fairy stories. And why did each child require a new partner of skates? Young, rich, possibly mad, people were the words whispered about the couple who ran the orphanage. But they paid well, and the boy was so charming that it was hard to stay mad at him, even when he refused to take the switch to some Helion who tracked mud across the entryway floor. He was sad to be a different relation of the Duke's, and through his table manners were fine enough. He had a soldier's way about him. He taught the murders how to hunt and trap, and the new ways of farming so favored by Ravka's king. The Duke himself had taken up residence at his winter house in Oz Alta. The last few years of the war had been hard on him. The girl was different, small and strange, with white hair that she wore loose down her back like an unmarried woman, seemingly oblivious to the glares and disapproving chuckling of the teachers and the staff. She told the students peculiar stories of flying ships in underground castles, of monsters who ate earth, and birds that rose on wings of flame. Often she went barefoot in the walls, and the smell of fresh paint never seemed to fade, as she was always starting on some new project or other, drawing a map over one of the classroom walls or covering the ceiling of the girls' dormitory with irises. Not such of an artist, sniffed one of the teachers. Certainly has an imagination, though, the other replied, peering skeptically at the white dragon that curled around the banister of the stairs. The students learned math and geography, science and art. Tradesmen were brought in from local towns and villages to offer apprenticeships. The new king hoped to abolish the draft in a 4-year system, and if he succeeded, every Rufkin would need some kind of trade. When the children were tested for Grisha powers, they were allowed to choose whether or not to go to the little palace, and they were always welcomed back to Karamzin. At night, they were told to keep the young king in their prayers. Coral Resny would keep Ravka strong. Here we go, last 2 pages. Here we go. Ooh. Even if the boy and the girl weren't quite nobility, they certainly had friends in high places. Give me a second. Okay, presents arrived frequently, sometimes marked with a royal seal. A set of atlases from the library, sturdy wool blankets, a new sleigh, and a pair of matched white horses to pull it. Once a man arrived with a fleet of toy boats that the children launched on the creek in in a miniature regatta. The teachers noted that the stranger was young and handsome, with golden hair and hazel eyes. Eh, ah, but most definitely odd. He stayed late to dinner and never once removed his gloves. Every winter, during the feast of Saint Nikolai, a troika would make its way up the snowy road, and three Grisha would emerge dressed in furs and thick wool kefta, red, purple, and blue. Their sledge, weighted down the presents, figs and apricots soaked in honey, piles of walnut candies, mink-lined gloves, and boots of buttersoft lather. They stayed up late, long after the children had gone to bed, talking and laughing, telling stories, eating pickled plums, and roasting lamb sausages over the fire. That first winter, when it was time for her friends to leave, the girl ventured out into the snow to say goodbye, and the mom and the stunning Rav hired haired squalor handed her another gift. A blue kefta, said the math teacher, shaking her head. What would we do with that? Maybe she knew a Grisha. Maybe she knew a Grisha who died, replied the cook, taking note of the tears that filled the girl's eyes. They did not see the note that read, "You will always be one of us." The boy and the girl had both known loss, and their grief did not leave them. Sometimes he would find her standing by a window, fingers playing in the beams of sunlight that streamed through the glass. Um, through the glass, or sitting on the front steps of the orphanage, staring at the stump of the oak next to the drive. When he would go to her, draw her close, and lead her to the shores of Trifka's pond, where the insects buzzed, and the grass grew high and sweet, where old wounds might. She saw sadness in the boy too, though the woods still welcomed him. He was separate from them now. The blonde girl. What was it? Where was I? Brunstub's orphanage and stump over next to the drive. Then he would go to her, down her clothes, and lead her to the shores of Trifka's pond, where the insects buzzed and the grass grew high and sweet, where old wounds might be forgotten. She saw sadness in the boy too, though the woods still welcomed him. He was separate from them now, the bond born into his bones burned away in the same moment that he'd given up his life for her. But then the hour would pass, and the teachers would catch them giggling in a door in a dim half hallway, or kissing by the stairs. Besides, most days were too full for morning. For morning. There were classes to teach, meals to prepare, letters to write. When evening fell, the boy would bring the girl a glass of tea, a slice of lemon cake, an apple blossom floating in a blue cap. He would kiss her neck and whisper new names in her ear: Beauty, beloved, cherished, my blood, my heart. They had an ordinary life, full of ordinary things. If you love, if love can ever be called that. Whew. That is the end of book 3 in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. Last little bit, we were having a hard time, but we made it through finally. I hope you all enjoyed this book. Please like, comment, and share this video down below, and we'll see you all in the next video. I'm the Epileptic Explorer, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening.